Hello, this is Paul Chapman and welcome to another Sabbath Bible Lesson Teacher's Video Aid. We're going through quarter number 2 of the Sabbath Bible Lessons, and we're looking at lesson number 2 this week, lesson entitled Gideon. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to get the first one up. I've been away overseas. After came back, had to go away again interstate, got sick, on the way back, came back, got sick, and it's just been one thing after another, so my apologies for not getting it up sooner. But look, I hope to get that first one up maybe sometime a bit after this one, hopefully very soon. But just looking at that, the lesson for this week, Gideon, and it follows on from last week's lesson, Israel and Canaan. Now what this Sabbath Bible lesson was about, remember, is we're following on now from the children of Israel, God wanting to establish them in the land of Canaan for his covenant-keeping people, and he wanted them to be a light there in that country, that nation, that land, that they would be a light to the Gentiles around them, and to do so required them to be a willing and obedient servants of God. And we found that as they went into that land, in at the end of last quarter, they've conquered Jericho, they've gone in, and God is now giving them victory after victory through Joshua. But we find now Joshua, in last week's lesson, Joshua had passed away. The covenant had been renewed, but then it was forgotten. And the children of Israel, after Joshua's death and after the men who outlived Joshua died, the children of Israel fell back into apostasy. They failed to do what God had wanted them to do, which was to drive out the inhabitants of that land so he could establish Israel in that land. But it wasn't just to establish Israel, because one of the conditions of inheritance is that the nation of a land is that the nation is righteous before God, and those nations had filled up the cup of their iniquity. So God was going to establish Israel there, not because of Israel's righteousness, but because of the iniquity of those nations. And so God was simply using Israel as an instrument of justice in his hand. Now, Israel failed to continue on in that work of judgment, failed to drive out the children of the Canaanites, and they instead put them to tribute, and it had terrible consequences. One of those being outright apostasy of the nation. They were led into idolatry, and eventually, under oppression from the nations around them, they cried out to God, and God raised up a judge. Now, not everyone went into apostasy, by the way. There was always, we learnt last week, there was always a remnant had not fallen into apostasy. That remnant, God would choose from among that remnant people who would deliver Israel. Now we introduced last week to Gideon, and we saw that Reformation first began in the home, and that's where it should begin for each one of us. And so now we're coming into Israel, or rather into Gideon now being used to deliver Israel for this week. And just in case you haven't been following, I'm using a method of a markup in my lesson to help me. I use the hash symbol. The hash symbol helps me identify those main points of a lesson. If you can see here, that hash symbol there. I have another one on that page and over here, and what those hash symbols do is they just help me to highlight those main points of each day's lesson. And what that does is, when I'm reading through the lesson, I can focus on those main points in my class. And sometimes if you're going over time, you've rushed to finish the lesson, at least you don't miss out those main points which you've established that you want to bring out in your class. Also, I'm teaching what we call the macro method of delivery, and that is where we've established what the main point of the lesson is from all of our micro points, all the various points made in each day. We've summarized them all into a main point, and we state that in the beginning of the lesson as the macro point. Then we have the micro points being brought out each day to support that. We summarize them at the end back into a macro point with a personal application. So that's what we want to do. So for this lesson, for this week, the main point of the lesson I got here is that, and actually this is quite clearly stated in the lesson, but it's this: I get that when it comes to deliverance, whether it be from sin or from doing missionary work or whatever it is, God is not honoured so much. Well, he's not honoured by numbers, but by the character of those who serve him. So God is not honoured by numbers. He doesn't depend upon numbers. but he's honoured by the character of those who serve him. And the character he wants is faith and humility. People who manifest faith and humility. And we'll see this brought out in the life of Gideon. However, we'll see also a terrible failure of Gideon at the very end. But it doesn't discount the good that he was able to accomplish, but we'll see a terrible failure as well that stands as a warning for us. Okay, so going through the lesson this week, we have the key verse there, Judges 7 verse 14. This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon and the son of Joash, a man of Israel, for into his hand has God delivered Midian and all the host. Keep this in mind, that it's God that gives deliverance to Israel. It's God that will give deliverance to his church. But he does it through cooperating with those within the church. It's like some people think God's going to deliver us by magic from apostasy or sin. No, God will work in ways that are out of the common order of things, but he will use instruments in his hand, human instrumentalities. And we see this all the way through the period of the Judges. So let's have a look at how he does this with Gideon. I'm just going to highlight that note there. All who would prepare for all who would be soldiers of the cross of Christ must gird on the armour and prepare for conflict. They should not be intimidated by threats or terrified by dangers. They must be cautious in peril, yet firm and brave in facing the foe and doing battle for good. Okay, or rather for God, I should say. So let's have a look now at the first section. A man willing to obey God. So now we've got a problem from last week. Israel's fallen to apostasy. God has chosen Gideon as a person who has not gone into that apostasy to deliver them. And let's have a look at how God first prepares Gideon to deliver the children of Israel. Let's have a look here. The section's called "A Man Willing to Obey God." Now I've got here, the Lord will not save us by numbers, but by humility and faith. We'll see how this was the fact with Gideon. All right. So we have here question 1a. It's asked about the Midian. God was going to call Gideon. God had already called Gideon, but when the Midianites and the Amalekites found out that Gideon was gathering together an army to come in against them, they gathered themselves together and moved out and camped in the valley of Jezreel. So so Gideon then, understanding that this had happened, he calls upon the help of the Lord to give battle to the invaders. And we see what he did here. He blew the trumpet, called Abiezer, he gathered himself to him, and he sent messages to Manasseh, to Asher, to Zebulun, to Naphtali. So he's called a number of the tribes of Israel to come in to his aid to help them against the Midianites and the Amalekites. Now, when they gathered themselves together, they numbered 32,000 soldiers. 32,000 who had come at the call of the trumpet. When the call had been given, they now come to do battle for the Lord, 32,000. And it's very significant under question, and this is what I've highlighted in my lesson, I've been bringing this point out, very significant under question 1b, or rather C I should say, the instruction that the Lord then gave to Gideon to reduce the army. Now, I'm not certain exactly how many Midianites and Amalekites there were, but as far as God was concerned, 32,000 men were too many to deliver Israel by. He said, in fact, that the reason it was too many because they might, it says there, that lest they lift themselves up in pride and say, "My hand has saved me." So God, remember, was the one who was their king. He was the one who had given them the land. It was God that was giving them victory, as many people use the Old Testament as a reason for military for military service and going to war, but in fact the Israelites were instruments in God's hand for that, and God had promised to give them this land, and He was going to fight for them. And so He would call the shots, as it were. So He raised up Gideon. Gideon called the army together. God says, no, this is too many for me to deliver you with. All right, there's too many people. So He's going to send some of them away. So what did God do? He told Gideon, He said, all right, everyone who's fearful, everyone who's afraid, let them go back to their homes, what have you. And we saw there that 22,000 left. And we have 10,000, so we have 10,000 remaining. And of those 10,000, God says, these are still too many. And so He says, send them down to the river to have a drink, and then whoever was to lap the water like a dog, put their hand down and lap up the water like a dog, would let them be set aside, and everyone who drinks the water with their mouth directly to the river, they were to be sent away. And when Gideon required the children of Israel perform this, Gideon noted those who were lapping like a dog, set them aside, and they numbered 300, and the rest were sent home. So now we have, from 32,000, we're now down to 300. Less than 1%. I think that's significant. Less than 1% were left over from that 32,000. So that's pretty amazing. I mean, today people look upon their numbers as some kind of guarantee of success in missionary work. They look upon their numbers as some kind of evidence of God's blessing. But here we find God doesn't care about the numbers. Well, He does care about the numbers. In fact, He cares that there's too many who He's going to be using in His army. And so He brings that army down from a full strength army down to 1% of that originally turned up. Can you believe that? So now with this 1% of the army left, what does God do with them? And now there's only 300. And imagine there's been thousands of the Midianites and Amalekites. Now we've just got 300 of these soldiers who had now shown themselves prepared for battle. So the reason why God did this, I want to bring out here. I want to highlight under this note here under question C. It says 1C. It says here that Gideon was filled with astonishment at the declaration that his army was too large, but the Lord saw the pride and unbelief existed in the hearts of His people. Now note that, pride and unbelief. In those 20, how many we've got there? We've got 31,700 people. The pride and unbelief in their hearts would have led them to exalt themselves had God given the victory. So here they had pride and unbelief. They're fearful. They're not wanting to go into battle. The vast majority don't really want to go and fight. But if they were to go and fight, God gives them the victory. They will take the glory to themselves. And that's the point. So God sends them home for that reason. So we should not trust in our numbers. We should not manifest pride and unbelief when it comes to doing God's work. We need to have that humility and faith that Gideon manifested, and those 300 would have manifested. So now we're looking under section number 2, no place for the indolent and self-indulgent. What lesson can we learn from the way that those men were tested? Well, just particularly in the end there, I would say this, that Mark 8:34 brings this out, that whoever wants to come after me, Jesus said, let him take up his cross and deny himself and follow me. In doing God's work requires self-denial, where our needs become secondary to God's needs. And that's what that note brings out, that the 300 chosen men were not only possessed courage and self-control, but they were men of faith. They did not defile themselves with idolatry. God could direct them and through them work deliverance for Israel. Success does not depend upon numbers, and this is the key point of the lesson. It does not, for me anyway, it does not depend upon numbers. God can deliver by few as well as by many. He is honoured not so much by the great numbers as by the character of those who serve Him. We don't need 2 million or 20 million or 200 million people to finish the work. We need men of courage, of faith, of humility, and of self-control who will not take the glory to themselves for the success in God's work. So that's what it says there. We want missionaries who will put all selfish consideration aside and let the cause of God come first. And who, as it says there, and who, working with an eye single to His glory, will keep themselves as minutemen, ready to go where He bids and to work in any capacity to spread the knowledge of the truth. That's the kind of people God wants. So, in view of this, it's a little side light to the lesson, in that is, in preparing people to be missionaries, it starts in the home, and particularly our duty with parents. And a question will be asked in the end: where's the flock, the precious flock that I've given you? I mean, that's echoed in the words of God to Jeremiah, or rather the words of Jeremiah to the king of Judah. Where's the flock, the precious flock that I've given you? You know, we have a responsibility for the flock that we are entrusted with, as pastors and ministers, or as parents. We have a responsibility for that flock, and so we need to train them not to be indolent, but to be useful, to become efficient and well-informed workers, not to be careless or indolent. So we have a responsibility. Don't ever think anyone has nothing to do, or to be educated to shirk off responsibility. You know, we are to train people to be bearers of responsibility. So, looking now under the section number 3, Tuesday's section, the sword of Gideon. It's entitled. A couple of points I highlighted here, and we see, and it's quite interesting what happens here. You know, Gideon has gone to survey the situation, and God, and he's now becoming fearful that, you know, we're only 300. I can imagine you might be thinking, we're 300. You know, as God, how can we overcome these ones? So he's gone to look at the situation, and then God sends him a message. So it says, Gideon, don't be afraid. I have delivered the host of Midian into your hand. Now, if you're still fearing, I want you to go down there, and he said, well, actually it says here, let me just read it. It's in Judges 7, 9 to 11. But if you fear, that's right, God said, if you fear, go down and go with Phurah, thy servant, down to the host, and thou shalt hear what they say. And afterward shall thy hands be strengthened to go down unto the host. So then he went down, so Gideon went down with Phurah, and they listened outside of the armed men that were in the host, to the outside of the armed men that were in the host. And they listened, and behold, they overheard someone having a dream, recounting a dream, I should say. They had, and in this dream, they saw this barley bread, this loaf of barley bread, rolled down into the camp of the Midianites. It smote one of the tents. So the tent was fell over and laid out flat, and they took this as a sign. Oh, this is none other than the sword of the Lord and Gideon. You know, that this is an omen that we have lost this battle already. And so straight away there was fear in these hearts of these Midianites. And now Gideon was now overhearing this, took heart from it, that God had indeed delivered them into the Israelites' hands. And this is what Gideon in fact went on to say to his people. He said, as it says there, Gideon returned unto the host of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord has delivered into your hand the host of Midian. And so, what does he do? The plan of attack that was suggested. Alright, 300 people. They took their trumpets. They had pitchers. And in those pitchers they were to place lamps, and then they were to surround the camp. And then they surrounded the camp, and at the signal they blew the trumpets, and they were to shout, the sword of the Lord and Gideon. Is that right? I think I got that right, is it? They held their trumpets, and yeah, that's right, the sword of the Lord and Gideon. And when they cried that out, a wonderful, wonderful deliverance was given to them. The plan that was suggested to them was of divine direction. Okay, so the sleeping army was suddenly aroused when these trumpets were blown. The lamps all of a sudden all came on, and they're surrounded by all these lights, and now they hear this great cry, the sword of the Lord and Gideon, and the Midianites now turn and to run. They're fearful. They feel that they're surrounded. In every direction was heard the sound of trumpets with the cry of the assailants, believing themselves at the mercy of an overwhelming force. The Midianites were panic-stricken with wild cries of alarm. They fled for their life, and mistaking, it says there in the note there, that mistaking even their own companions for enemies, they turned upon each other. So that's pretty amazing way of how God delivered them. The 300 men didn't even have to raise a sword. It just shows how God can use instruments, if they're human instrumentalities, for His glory, if they are willing to obey Him completely, trust in Him implicitly, and manifest that humility and faith He wants us to manifest. So now we have, under Wednesday's lesson, Gideon before an internal conflict. Alright, so now the Midianites have fled, and we now have under this section here, A, that as soon as when did the section A here brings out, let me just see here, that the men of Israel, it says that Judges 7:23, that the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali and out of Asher and out of all Manasseh, and pursued after the Midianites. Right, when they heard what was happening, they pursued after the Midianites, and they conquered or defeated the remnant of those Midianites. Now, afterwards, the Ephraimites become angry with Gideon, because Gideon had never sent them the messengers to gather the people from the tribe of Ephraim to battle, and they felt jealous, I imagine. They said, "Why did you not send us to fight? Why did you not call us?" And when you went to fight against the Midianites, and they did chide him sharply, it says in the scripture. And Gideon said, and notice Gideon's response. I think it's remarkable that he says, "What have I done in comparison to you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb, and what was I able to do in comparison of you?" Then their anger was abated toward him when he had said that. So God, what have I done in comparison to what you've done? You've defeated the rest of them. God's given them into your hands. You can, so and I think it's just a show of his humility and modesty, because he had just had a tremendous battle, or rather be given a tremendous victory without having to lift his sword. It's like, it was like what God did through him was something miraculous, and yet he said, "What have I done in comparison to what you've done?" God's given you all these Canaanites, or it says there the Midianites, rather sorry, the Canaanites, the Midianites, from the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. And so, what am I able to do in comparison to you? I just think that was a really noble gesture on his part, to acknowledge that he is, what he's done is nothing in comparison to what they've done. So that satisfied them, and they went away happy. So this is a true spirit. It says there, the firm and uncompromising, where principle was concerned, and in war a mighty man of valour. Gideon displayed also a spirit of courtesy that is rarely witnessed. He could have argued with them and had a great hoo-ha with them, and got into argument and conflict, but no, he just humbly said, "Look, what you've done is far greater than what I've done, so praise God." And they were accepted with that. So what must a person learn then before he or she becomes a successful soul winner? Well, just on that lesson there, a few verses are brought out here. Firstly, Proverbs 15 verse 1, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger." And Proverbs 15:33, "The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honour is humility." So keep these in mind. Sometimes in our discussions with people who are our opponents, or people who don't agree with us, maybe they're trying to question us, they're being sarcastic, they're being aggressive. You know, we don't need to degenerate into their same attitude in our responses. We simply need to manifest soft answers, and they will turn away wrath. Humility is before honor. Okay, humility is before honor. Let your speech, it says there, let your speech, your soft tongue breaks the bone in Proverbs 23 verse 15, and Colossians 4 verse 6, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man. I think that's important, and I know sometimes in our discussions that we have, and I notice this online in particular, because we're hiding behind a keyboard. You know, we sometimes think that we have liberty to manifest harsh words or unkind words and what have you, but you know, the same principles apply there. A soft answer turns away wrath. Let our speech, let the things that we type always be seasoned with grace in our conversations, whether it be through the keyboard or through our verbal conversation. Let it always be seasoned with grace, and it's going to give us far more effect with the people. Okay, so that's something to learn. So a couple of points there in that note. The leader whom God chose to overthrow the Midianites occupied no prominent position in Israel. It says here, he was not a ruler, a priest, or a Levite. He himself, he thought himself the least in his father's house. But God saw in him a man of courage and integrity. He was distrustful of himself and willing to follow the guidance of the Lord. And God does not always choose for his work men of the greatest talents, but he selects those whom he can best use. And that's why God often passes over the great men of the earth. You know, those who are proud and self-sufficient, because he can't use them. Or if he would use them, they would take the glory to themselves in any successes they gained. And so God is looking for human instrumentalities, those who cherish true humility. And if we would do that, God could do a lot more through us than he's doing for us now. True humility is something that I would be emphasizing under Wednesday's lesson. Okay, that's for the class. That we need to manifest that true humility that Gideon had and that Christ had. And that humility comes through the surrender of our pride. And that's a change of heart. That can only come through conversion. So this is where we have the gospel message coming in. It's only the gospel that can melt our hearts. So we need to understand that gospel to see ourselves in the light of the cross and to experience that true humility that surrenders itself at the foot of the cross. And to maintain that humility in every aspect of our life, wherever we go, whatever we do. And God then can use us and do great and marvellous things through us. And let's just remember to cherish that humility. Alright, so looking now into Thursday's lesson, the mind of Gideon finally confused. And this is a very, very sad ending to Gideon's life. And for me, two things come out here: presumption and the power of influence. Okay, under this day's lesson, and that is this. After the armies of Israel had gained this victory over the Midianites, how did Satan work through the mind of Gideon? Well, it says there that under Judges, that Gideon said unto them, I would desire a request of you that you would give me every man the earrings of his prey, for they had golden earrings, because they were Ishmaelites. And Gideon made an ephod thereof and put it in his city, and even in Ophrah, and all Israel went thither and were whoring after it. And that means God likens Israel when they committed, because God likens the relationship he has with his people to marriage. If the children of Israel start to wander through committing idolatry, God calls that spiritual adultery. So this language here, they went whoring after this ephod. It means that ephod became an image to them, an image of worship, and they were whoring after it. They were bowing down to it. They were worshipping that, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his household, and to the generations of Israel that followed the death of Gideon, because they were influenced by it, as the note brings out here. It says that the unauthorized worship led many of the people finally to forsake the Lord altogether, to serve idols. After Gideon's death, great numbers among them were his own family, joined in this apostasy. The people were led away from God by the very man who had once overthrown their idolatry. Now, we don't have ephods to worship today, but there's many things that we can be setting up before us. Anything that takes our time from God becomes an idol to us. And we can go whoring after those things. It could be fashion, it could be music, it could be our recreational pursuits, it could be our work lives, the kind of jobs we're in, the material things, cars, houses. All these things can become idolatry. They can become objects of worship to us. That is, they take our true devotion away from, they eat away the spiritual. You know, we read another statement that fashion eats out the spirituality of God's people. So these things can all be idols to us, and we can make the same mistakes as Gideon made. We can think ourselves, oh, wonderful, we've done some wonderful missionary work, and we come home and we stick on a football game on television and start watching that and get totally sidetracked and get caught up in the spirit of the competitive sports or something like that. Or we've done a wonderful self-denial in helping feed or clothe the children in a faraway country that's in need of clothing, and yet we go and spend $300 on a new blouse or a new pair of trousers or shoes or whatever. I mean, you know, it's just needless expenses. I'm not talking about, sure we need clothing, but just the needless things and the things that we're just doing to follow fashion, and things that become, you know, I think sometimes we can be immodest as well in those fashions. So we should be careful of that. Now, all these things can become idols to us. So from this lesson, yeah, the ephod in Israel's day, that was an object of worship. I mean, it was an object that was a symbol of God's worship, and Israel turned it into an idol. All right, so we don't have ephods today, but many things can be idols to us. So let's just be mindful that we don't presume upon God's acceptance of our extracurricular activities simply because He's given us some signal victory in missionary work or some wonderful blessing in some other aspect of our lives. Okay, because look what happened with Gideon. Same thing can happen with us. So, just coming back to that macro point, God is not honoured so much by numbers as by the character of those who serve Him. He's looking for the pride, rather, He's looking for humility, and He's looking for faith in His people. So, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and may God bless you in your study of the Sabbath School lesson this week. If you have any questions, pop them in the comments below the video. Happy to answer those, and until next time, take care, God bless, and enjoy your study of the Sabbath Bible lessons, the light of the world.